Hi, everybody. Well, we are in the policing units and organization section, chapter 4, on week 6. You've had an exam, and I'm working through those. I should have those up shortly for you. Sometimes I have trouble with the software to get it to load the grades up to you and release them. So, I'll let you know when they're supposed to be up, and if they're not, then just let me know, and I'll fiddle with this and try to get this to work. This seems to be a challenge for me with the software with Beachboard and the producer desire to learn. So this week we've got a couple interesting things to think about. When you look at the chapter, the first thing the chapter talks about is the concept of order maintenance versus law enforcement. And I think the way that the authors fall is that the police should be more concerned about order maintenance. And they make mention of the political era and how order maintenance was important in the political era. But it's interesting because they say order maintenance or maintenance of the status quo for the political powers to help them, in essence, maintain their jobs. And then they talk about the professional era, and the professional era fell towards law enforcement. And you can decide whether or not you think that was a good thing, but understand that the professional era, took hold in the 50s and progressed up through the 90s. And the end of the 80s, after community policing had been around for a short period of time, for just a few years, sky-high crime rate. Crack cocaine was causing inner cities to have huge problems. So I think the intent of the authors are to use order maintenance for the idea of maintaining the civil liberties and rights of individual citizens. Now, a thing for you to think about with that concept is, do the police enforce civil liberties, or do the police, in their actions, in their enforcement actions, uphold the Constitution? The Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments primarily. And of course, there's a little bit of First Amendment throws in there when they're deciding, what to do with somebody who's, standing in the middle of the street with no clothes on and is saying that it's their right to do so because they're going to protest the current administration, and this shows it's their First Amendment right or some such nonsense. So the police have that Fourth Amendment, which restricts how they work. And in the Constitution, the Constitution restricts how the federal government works. The state constitution restricts how the state government works. So, I saw a lot of this in due process discussion, where people said that our due process crime control. Well, crime control model just ignores people's civil rights and arrests them at all costs and things of that nature, which is totally wrong. Under the crime control model, the police need to follow the Constitution, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment, follow what the courts have said. And I think it's a tremendous disservice to the police when people think that they're just running rampant over civil rights just because they can. And if you have agencies that are doing so, then something needs to be done by the district attorney. The DA needs to not file cases, provide documentation. The attorneys for the counsel for the defendants need to refer the cases for civil suit if there's been a loss, and those kind of things. But really think about that idea of civil liberties and the police enforcing civil liberties, as opposed to the police functioning in a manner that does not act in contravention to civil liberties. I hope that makes some sense to you. The second thing that I want you to get out of this particular chapter is the idea of organizational structure. If you go into the LAPD website, you can see their org chart, and you can see it has just tons of layers of people, of management people, and those generally are considered the chief and deputy chief, and assistant chiefs. In a smaller organization, it's going to be the chief, the deputy chief maybe, and his captains. And then you have a mid-management, which is a more of a closer liaison between the line people and the in senior management. And then you have supervision and supervision of sergeants that are in the field and are enforcing policy and providing resources to officers, making sure that people are notified when there's a necessity of notification of the chain on a particular or any particular incident that might happen that needs that. So that's the basic structure. Under community policing, the concept was to eliminate as many mid-managers as possible, and then you use what used to be a senior manager to cover a geographic area, and then you would use your mid-managers, and then they would handle other specialty areas that needed to be oversight. Field training is a good example. Probably detectives is another good example. Detectives really need oversight because of the level of autonomy that a detective might have. We'll talk about it in investigation later in the semester, but tons of really bad things that I'm aware of that have happened. And then the idea of your supervisors and handling the beat, the day-to-day interactions, patrol interactions, and such. And I talked at length last night with a chief of an LA County agency, and we were talking about some of this organizational stuff. And I mentioned to him that I knew of an agency that has gone to make their agency tall again. And what they've done is they no longer have captains or commanders in charge of patrol areas, but they've returned them to the responsibility for records and vehicle maintenance and the property room. I mean, and understand, records and property are hugely important and great places for, I think the proper police term is for shenanigans to happen, and and so you got to keep a tight rein on those areas. You have to be really careful about who's in charge in there, who has access to stuff, how people get in, all of those, kind of what the structure of it is. Another chief that I know was telling me that they went to a small agency in a very rural environment, and when he first came in, his first day, he wanted to tour the property room. So he went in the property room with the property sergeant, and there was a window that for access or light or whatever into the property room, and then bars over it. And somebody had smashed out the window, and everything within arm's reach on the shelves, evidence, whatever, had been taken and was now missing. So those things really, are just totally prone to bad things happening. Other things where you have potential problems are, we used to call in the old days, back when I was a little tiny baby policeman, V&I, Vice, Narcotics, and Intelligence. Now, most agencies that are, under 150, 200, maybe 250 and below, will have a separate narcotics group, and then that narcotics will occasionally handle vice complaints. Maybe they'll work, prostitution stings. They'll work bathroom problems where people, try to make sexual contact in bathrooms. And then intelligence, which can be really, interesting because the police get a lot of information. People calling in, people trying to be good Samaritans, people trying to get people in trouble. And so they may come into some really significant information when it comes to the public. So that's one that really needs to be kept tightly under control. Canine usually works out of patrol, and then but there's a high potential for liability there. Whenever you've got dogs biting people, bad things can happen. And then the last area that is important to think about in this is going to be SWAT, and that's going to be part of your discussion board this week, and the concept of militarizing the police. And it starts out with a CNN video that has a Lenco Bearcat on the cover. Some of the Bearcat stuff started with the fear of the country going to war, and after 9/11, it turned out that the fear of something coming over here in large scale was unfounded. But there was a time, and I was right in the middle of all of that stuff when I was in SWAT, with what was, what our threat level was, what things could happen. Looking at if you had theaters or a mall or schools, North Ossetia, with the attack on the school there, and that didn't happen until a few years later. But it was a scenario that we talked about, discussed, tried to game plan a little bit, with maybe limited results. But when the Bearcats became available, and what you have is agencies will usually share the vehicle, and its real value is in SWAT ops when you are trying to get close to a place and there's a potential for armed resistance. And that's when it really works well. The chief and I were talking last night about Ferguson, and the fact that Ferguson didn't really do us any favors, but what people don't realize is that the officers were taking gunfire consistently. Rodney King riots in Long Beach, protecting firemen. Bullets were flying all over the place. Snipers were taking shots. Fortunately, they weren't very good shots, but nonetheless, the military called it the Golden BB, where in Vietnam, a jet would fly over in attack mode, and farmers would take whatever guns they had and just shoot straight up in the air, with the idea of maybe one bullet would hit a plane, and that happened, a few times, and then down aircraft or dead pilots, or downed aircraft and then dead pilots. That happened quite a bit. So you've got the concept of law enforcement versus order maintenance, and then the second idea of the organizational structure, and then the third idea of the specialty units and which ones are really high liability. SWAT, high liability. It's usually when SWAT gets called out, somebody's not having a good day, and it could result in a really bad outcome. V&I, vice narcotics, intel, narcotics, great chance to get officers hurt, great chance to get other people hurt because of the level of violence in those situations can be great. Vice is another high liability area because people, when they see that everybody in the neighborhood's going to know that they got arrested for, some sexual misconduct, have a tendency to react really seriously and violently. And then the idea of intelligence, which high liability because you get information on people which may or may not be true, and then what do you do with it? So those are the big things I want you to look at. Hope you enjoy the discussion board, and it should be lively. With that,